The final wave of Fire Emblem Engage's DLC just dropped this week, and now that we've presumably seen all the content the game has to offer, it's time I took another look at those legacy Paralogues. Be sure to check out the first video on the Paralogues in the base game if you haven't already, to get an idea of how I'm ranking these maps. The short version is that I'm trying to gauge which ones best represent the games they come from, be that through their map mechanics, their recreation of important story moments or nods to characters and events, or some combination of the two. In this video, I'm going to be ranking the 6 Divine Paralogues that came with the DLC, and toward the end, I'm going to be taking a look back at the base Paralogues and deciding how this set of maps stacks up against those. One nice thing about the Divine Paralogues is that their challenge level scales with your story progress, so unlike a few of the base Paralogues, none of them feel like they've been simplified solely because they're available earlier. Aside from that distinction, the metrics are basically all the same, so let's get right into it. I can't rank this one along with the rest. It's not a legacy map. It's got the hero's summoning stone, and I'm guessing it's supposed to evoke other raids since those also take place on islands in the sky, but the visuals and the gimmick of needing to step on switches to create a bridge over to Veronica's location puts me more in mind of the Vala maps of Fates. Even setting that aside, however, Veronica's Paralogue just isn't that impressive, which is frankly surprising. With Heroes being the series' biggest financial draw, I would have thought that the developers would have gone all out in selling the mobile game here, but I can't imagine this Paralogue making anyone want to play Heroes. They could have been so much more creative. Maybe limit you to 4 units and make you fight through a series of small rectangular maps like in Tempest Trials. But what we actually got is incredibly basic. Veronica doesn't even summon Emblem characters so far as I've ever seen, which would have been much more in line with most Heroes' story chapters. Even the presentation feels muddled, with Veronica's design and the music track taken from Book 6 last year, but her personality lifted from her initial characterization when the game launched in 2017. I'm normally not one to sing the praises of Heroes, but IS really dropped the ball on this one. This was another easy one to rank. As a representation of an old map, Camilla's Paralogue is an oddity. It's loosely inspired by Birthright Chapter 23. And I say that because the layout is completely different, as is Camilla's Dragon Vein function. There's no need to get that nitpicky when outlining why this Paralogue isn't a great one though, because it's just so long. This map is almost certainly going to take more turns than any other Legacy Paralogue, including those in the base game. And most of that time is nothing more than funneling your units through narrow corridors on a slow march to the boss. You could potentially exploit the Dragon Vein gimmick by fielding a bunch of flyers to cross over the half-destroyed debris, but that still keeps you advancing on Camilla's schedule. It's a shame, too, because once you finally get to her, Camilla can make for a challenging opponent. And as a nod to the original, she's flanked by a Wyvern Knight and a Bow Knight representing her retainers. It's just that reaching them takes an unreasonably long time. Most of the difficulty of this map comes from how your units are going to end up strewn out along these corridors cleaning up reinforcements from behind, leaving you with fewer options for taking out Camilla when she heads your way. I believe this is one case of a legacy Paralogue where the developers prioritize the relevance of the story moment over the gameplay experience, which doesn't entirely work anyway because the dialogue needs to remain non-committal about which route Corrin chose. I will give Camilla credit for being almost too sexy for the superficially tame Engage, but that's not enough to save her Paralogue from the bottom of the ranking. As I noted last time, thanks to the unusual choice for Lynn's Paralogue, this is Blazing Blade's only legacy map in Engage. It's a solid option for Hector especially, important to his story and featuring a unique hazard that plays into this game's larger emphasis on the poison status. I'd hardly call it an iconic FE7 map though, and it is somewhat disappointing to see the Paralogue give you a standard number of deployment slots. Much of what makes the original chapter memorable is that you can only take a freshly promoted Hector and one or two other units in here, sharply limiting your options. Poison being redesigned doesn't help either, because it's now less immediately threatening and easier to play around, with the map's many corridors giving you more control over which of your units will have to see combat. The vents end up more of a positioning nuisance than anything else. Hector himself is only as hard as you make him, since he can get poisoned himself while charging, and you can pull him back pretty far from his starting position. At least the developers didn't take any inspiration from the first iteration of this particular case seen in Binding Blade. That map is Fog of War. But fortunately, hiding away in the darkness isn't really Hector's style. In a similar vein, Tiki's Paralogue is the first and only one from its game. In this case, Mystery of the Emblem and its remake. It also has to be completed before any of the other Divine Paralogues. Contrary to what you might expect from that though, this map doesn't pull any punches with its difficulty. It's got out-of-reach staff bots to harass you, powerful dragons that can freeze you in place, and a layout that encourages you to divide up your forces. There's also the placement of the silver card, located on the same isolated tile as a secret shop in the original. The choice of Tiki as essentially the lead bracelet emblem is a bit of a curious one, although I suppose they wanted to reserve that role for someone from Marth's games. Overall, this map accomplishes exactly what the Divine Paralogues ought to: provide a fresh gameplay experience that fills in a gap missing in the base set of Paralogues, and makes for a fun throwback to its source game. Also, shout out to this Paralogue as one of the only times I've ever seen a video game use ice as a beneficial terrain type. Movement boosting effects are always fun. Now we're getting into the Divine Paralogues that I believe take the concept a step beyond. Soren's Paralogue is similar to some that I've already talked about. It's taken from a map known more for its unique hazard than for its story relevance, but it improves upon the original enough to allow it to stand out. In Radiant Dawn, this chapter is all about not standing in the fire, a bit like avoiding the poison vents in the map that inspired Hector's Paralogue. However, Engage complicates this with the addition of smoke that gradually fills the battlefield. This can sometimes push your units onto the lava tiles, because the alternative is facing enemies with reduced defensive stats. Soren himself is one of the squishier emblems, but he's also that most annoying type of Fire Emblem boss, the kind that's a pain to even approach as he's constantly blasting you with long-range magic. I can forgive him though, because Soren drops the snarky asshole bit if you bring Ike along for the battle. I'm more of an Ike Ranulph shipper personally, but that's still pretty cute. I confess that I am genuinely surprised to be giving Chrom the top spot of the DLC Paralogues. When I first saw the map that they'd chosen here, I was baffled. It's bad enough that Lucina's Paralogue uses the incredibly basic arena battle, but here the developers picked another wide-open and mostly featureless space, all but embracing Awakening's reputation for uninspired map design. When you actually play Chrom's Paralogue, though, you quickly realize that it has nothing in common with Chapter 23 beyond the basic layout. There's crystals that all have to be destroyed on the same turn. A bunch of water tiles spawn in the bottom section that you have to navigate around. Sages with long-range magic and high-movement reinforcements from the south pressure you to bring down the barrier as quickly as possible. And when you finally reach the emblems, they're camped out with a quartet of well-chosen generics that all benefit from the defensive tiles they're standing on. This paralogue goes out of its way to sell Robin as the tactician that he's actually supposed to be. It's something that I've never taken very seriously before, because I always saw it as Awakening leaning on the fourth wall regarding what avatars really are. But yeah, this map is a welcome surprise and a much-needed glow-up. Igniting renewed interest in the gay Krobin ship is just a bonus as far as I'm concerned. That's how I believe the DLC paralogues stack up against each other, but now I want to consider how each of them fares alongside the paralogues in the base game that I ranked in the previous video. Obviously, Veronica's paralogue remains unranked and thus below all the others, because it fails by virtually every metric I'm using to measure these things. Camilla's paralogue offers more substance than Lucina's, but I'd place it below all the rest because it's just too long and tedious. Mart's paralogue may not be all that interesting, and Lynn's paralogue may not reflect her source game at all, as opposed to Camilla's not reflecting hers very well, but at least they can both be completed in a reasonable time frame. Hector's paralogue winds up in the lower middle section of the ranking, above Celica. It presents a more drawn-out challenge than hers does, and I also consider it better than Byleth's for actually folding the main conflict of Blazing Blade into its dialogue. But as an interesting gameplay challenge, it falls short of Roy's paralogue and those higher up. Tiki's paralogue lands just outside the top 5, outranking Erica's paralogue for being both more memorable and more interesting to play through, but not quite reaching the levels of the two base Tellius paralogues with their solid nods to the characters and events of those games. I do nevertheless have to give Tiki's map credit for feeling more like a winter-themed stage than Makaya's, which is less snowy than its original version, but that's just my own aesthetic bias. Soren's paralogue, on the other hand, ranks above the other Tellius maps. It's an even more clever evolution of an already competently designed map than Ike's paralogue, although the lack of any meaningful story nods keeps it out of the top 3. That leaves me with Crom's paralogue, and you know what? I think it deserves the number 2 slot. Unlike Leaf's paralogue, it lacks the feel of its base game, but in all other respects, Crom's paralogue is a fantastic and challenging bit of innovation, and a strong showcase for Robin's character outside the Avatar role, as well as the relationship that forms the heart of Awakening. That's worthy of a spot near the very top. But what did you think? How well did the Divine Paralogues measure up against those in the base game for you? Are there any legacy maps you would have liked to have seen in Engage? Tell me about it in the comments. And be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel for more content, Fire Emblem and otherwise. Thanks for watching. Au revoir!